The fog hung low over the city streets, and inside a quiet brownstone, secrets waited patiently to be uncovered. An heiress's fortune, a vanished envelope, and whispered schemes weave a tangled web of betrayal, ambition, and hidden truths. Tonight, you'll step into a world where every polite gesture masks calculation, and every silence holds its own danger. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. Let me know in the comments. Settle in, because this mystery begins now. Fritz was in a romantic mood that afternoon. He'd gone and turned out a lamb ragout so soft it could have confessed under cross-examination, and the scent of roasted garlic and rosemary had already made its rounds through the brownstone twice before I got my first forkful. Wolfe was across from me at the dining table, doing his usual routine, eyes on his plate, thoughts 1,000 leagues off, likely lingering somewhere in Byzantium with Suetonius or Saladin. I wasn't about to interrupt him with anything too modern, not while Fritz was within earshot and Wolfe had lamb in his mouth. But I couldn't help myself. I slid the folded page of the Gazette across the linen. "Page 6, third item from the bottom," I said. "Says here heiress Lila Thorne's engaged to Clifford Dane, financier, philanthropist, and incidentally, old enough to have taught her how to tie her shoes." Wolfe grunted. "That's an exaggeration. Okay, maybe just old enough to have taught her how to read, or to handle bearer bonds." He gave me a sour glance, then stabbed a carrot cube with the precise disdain of a Roman senator. "I assume you find this noteworthy," he said. "I find it unusual. Clifford Dane doesn't marry, he consolidates." That, of course, is an interpretation, one flavored with envy, cynicism, and adolescent spite. "Sure," I said, "and your tone is flavored with ragout and regret." His brows didn't rise. Wolfe doesn't do facial acrobatics, but his eyes narrowed by a micron. "I regret very little, Archie, especially when it comes to affairs of the wealthy." At that moment, Fritz entered with the second course, fennel salad with lemon. Wolfe shifted to his napkin. I folded the paper again. Neither of us knew it yet, but that announcement, tucked under gossip about a faded actress's twin divorce, would soon have Clifford Dane at the center of a lie, Lila Thorne in tears, and Wolfe locked into a case he'd try very hard not to take. But that was 15 minutes and one interruption away. The interruption arrived, as so many do, without a phone call and without warning. I had just refilled my coffee, a rare after-lunch indulgence, when Fritz stepped into the dining room with a look that was equal parts apology and alarm. "There is a young woman," he said carefully, "in the front room. She would not give her name but insists she must speak with Mr. Wolfe, immediately." Wolfe didn't move. "Did you attempt to redirect her?" "Yes." She sat down and folded her hands. Wolfe sighed. "Then she has committed the act of squatting in my home. Show her in." When Lila Thorne walked into the room, she brought with her the kind of poise that usually arrives after 4 generations of East Coast breeding and 1 summer in Cannes. She was dressed like someone who had money but didn't want to talk about it, and her eyes, dark, strained, unmistakably intelligent, were the only things she didn't try to conceal. She looked at Wolfe, then at me, then back to Wolfe again. "I'm sorry to come like this. I had nowhere else to—" "You're here," Wolfe said. "Nowhere else has ceased to matter." He gestured to the chair across from him. She sat with effort. "I'm Lila Thorne." "Yes," he replied. "I am regrettably aware." She flushed. "You've read the column?" Archie Goodwin, mind reader, decided to keep quiet. Wolfe nodded. "I have read it. I have also dined." She straightened her spine. "It's not true. The engagement, I mean. It's complicated. I announced it for legal reasons." Now Wolfe blinked. "Once." "My father died 2 years ago," she continued. "Since then, certain financial matters have become difficult. Someone is trying to take control of what's mine. I was standing, but my feet shifted. And why, Wolfe said, would a fictitious engagement aid your position? Because Clifford Dane, she said, is one of the people trying to help. Or that's what he says. I don't know what to believe anymore. I knew that look on Wolfe's face, the one that meant he was annoyed, intrigued, and hoping it would all go away in 5 minutes. It didn't. I don't suppose, Wolfe said. You've brought with you evidence. Something tangible, not tabloid fluff. Lila hesitated. My father left me an envelope. Before he died. Wolfe held his breath. He told me not to open it, just to keep it safe. It had no label except for safety. I kept it in my desk. And? It's gone. Her voice cracked. I didn't need a violin to know it was genuine. Wolfe put down his napkin. That, for him, was a jolt. You had it in your desk for how long? 1.5 years. Then 3 weeks ago, after I announced the engagement, it vanished. Did you show it to anyone? No, I only mentioned it to Clifford once, casually. Ah, Wolfe said. He paused. And your housekeeper, your maid, no one else had access? I don't know. Maria, my maid, she's been with me for 6 years. She wouldn't… He raised a hand. Please, let us not lean on character. Let us lean on what can be known. I cleared my throat. Miss Thorne. Lila, she said softly. Lila, if your father left something meant for safety, and it disappeared the moment you stepped into this engagement, then the danger isn't behind you, it's walking beside you. Wolfe didn't contradict me. That was the second jolt. He looked at her and frowned. Describe the envelope. Color, size, weight. Did it have a seal? A monogram? No seal. Off-white. Thicker paper. Folded once. It looked ordinary. They always do, I muttered. Wolfe stood. Not abruptly. Nothing Wolfe did was abrupt, but decisively. I dislike sentiment, Miss Thorne, but I detest manipulation. He stared out the window for a moment. Mr. Goodwin, he said, we shall make a preliminary inquiry. And just like that, the door opened a crack. My first assignment, naturally, was to get a good look at Clifford Dane, the man supposedly helping Lila Thorne stay solvent by pretending to love her, or the man genuinely engaged to her and hiding it under a pile of posthumous finance. He was easier to find than I expected. Clifford Dane liked being seen. He was tall, built like a man who bought his suits in London, but never crossed the Atlantic, and he had the kind of haircut that required 3 mirrors and someone named Salvatore. When I spotted him walking out of a private club on Park and 62nd, he had the air of a man just closing a deal, crisp, composed, and giving nothing away. He didn't hold hands with Lila. He didn't mention her. He didn't even check his phone for messages. Instead, he paused, looked both ways like a man not accustomed to being followed, and lit a cigarette. I stayed back, half shadow, half annoyance, and watched. 15 minutes later, he stepped into a waiting car and headed downtown. I didn't follow yet. I wanted one more look, one more detail that would make Wolfe raise his brow and hum. And I got it. Before stepping into the car, Clifford Dane took out a small, tan envelope from his inner pocket. He didn't open it. He just looked at it, touched it with his thumb, then tucked it back inside. It wasn't the envelope, I knew that much, but it was something. And in this business, something beats nothing. I tailed Dane to a club on the west side, one of those places where no one wears a name tag, but everybody knows who has money and who wants it. I slipped in through the back, nodded at the coat attendant, and took up residence in the lounge. It didn't take long. Clifford Dane met with a man in a 3-piece suit, so tight, I wondered if he'd been sewn into it. They didn't shake hands, just exchanged nods and got to business. That's how I knew it was legal. I edged close enough to hear the basics. Words like adjustment, estate executor, and legal latitude floated across the bourbon and wood panelling. The man was Lila's family lawyer, a guy named Harrington. I'd seen his name in the obituary section once and assumed he was already retired. Apparently, he still had a few strings to pull. What got me was the tone. This wasn't a meeting of allies. It was a transaction. I scribbled notes on a napkin I didn't intend to leave behind. I'd seen enough. Outside, the air was crisper than I liked, and my breath hung in the dark like a second opinion. I fished out my phone and dialed Wolfe. He answered after the third ring. Fritz must have been in the kitchen, and Wolfe never picked up before 3 unless I was out. Yes? It's a party, I said. Clifford Dane just had a closed-door chat with Harrington. No champagne, no smiles. They weren't talking about the wedding menu. Silence. Then, "Thank you, Archie," returned promptly. That's it? I am not a man who reaches conclusions before the ingredients are stirred. I smiled. Stirring's done. The pot's already boiling. I clicked off and slid the phone back in my coat. Wolfe would hate this, of course, being dragged into a financial family mess with no guarantee of murder or mystery. But something had shifted. He wouldn't say it yet, not in words, but I knew him well enough to know the signs. The hunt was on, and someone, maybe Clifford, maybe Agatha Royce, maybe even Lila, had just made a move on the board. A hidden move was already in play. When Wolfe told Lila we would make a preliminary inquiry, he meant, as usual, that I would do the legwork while he sat in his chair communing with logic and orchids. But before I could be kicked out the door, we had to review the basics, and in Wolfe's house, basics require ritual. We were back in the office. Wolfe had returned to his chair, the one with enough butt indentation to hold legal precedent, and I was perched on the edge of my desk with a notebook open, pencil in hand. Lila was across from him, composed again, but only just. "You insist the envelope was locked in your desk?" Wolfe asked. "I always kept the drawer locked. No one had the key but me." "And yet it vanished," he said flatly. "Did it walk?" Her mouth opened, then closed. "No," she said. "It was taken." "And yet your maid denies ever seeing it," I added. "She wouldn't have," Lila snapped, turning toward me. "It wasn't in plain sight." "She's been with you 6 years," I said. "That means she's either loyal, blind, or paid well to be both." Wolfe held up a hand. "Mr. Goodwin is being flippant, but not irrelevant." I jotted a note. Desk, drawer, maid. Wolfe leaned back. "Do you trust her?" I did. "And now?" Lila looked at her gloves, folded tightly in her lap. "I don't know." There it was. Not guilt, not grief, just that quiet corrosion doubt leaves behind. Wolfe noted it. He always did. He closed his eyes, which meant he was either finished or ready to deliver a pronouncement. I waited. His lips barely moved. If the envelope contained nothing of value, it would not have disappeared. I nodded, already moving toward the door. Wolfe didn't glance up. "Start with Mr. Dane." Clifford Dane had the kind of face that belonged in oil, not on canvas, but in barrels. Slick, polished, expensive, and liable to catch fire if rubbed the wrong way. I caught him in his midtown office between meetings, though judging by the untouched papers on his desk, he hadn't been in one all morning. He greeted me with a smile that said diplomat, and eyes that said dealer. "Mr. Goodwin, is it? You're working with Mr. Wolfe?" "I'm his legs," I said. "He has no use for stairs." Clifford chuckled. "Ah, the famous Nero Wolfe. Tell him I send my respect." "I'll send him your answers first. Let's start with the engagement. Real or not?" His smile twitched, just slightly. "It's real," he said. "Emotionally real, certainly." I raised an eyebrow. "That sounds like a lawyer's version of love." He leaned back in his chair. "Lila and I understand each other. Her situation is complicated. Mine too. There are legacy concerns, settlement issues. Emotional attachment doesn't have to preclude strategic compatibility." That almost sounded human. He let the sarcasm bounce off his cufflinks. "You're implying something." "I'm observing. So is Wolfe. We hear you've been speaking with her lawyer." He didn't blink. Of course I have. Harrington's still tied to the estate. Were you aware Charles Thorne left an envelope with Lila? I was not. But if you had been, would you have wanted it? Misfiled. That got a flicker. Just a flicker. A hairline fracture in the corporate veneer. I have no idea what you're implying, he said calmly. And unless you've come to accuse me of something, I suggest we end here. I stood, slowly. Oh, we're not accusing. Yet. He didn't ask me to leave, but he didn't shake my hand either. Just watched as I walked out, carrying more silence than answers, and enough tension to report back with interest. Back in the brownstone, Wolfe had retreated to the orchid room. I found him among the phalaenopsis, arms folded, eyes half-lidded, lips tight. If the orchids had ears, they'd have heard some choice language about the moral architecture of the rich. "You've spoken with Mr. Dane?" he asked without turning. "Just returned. He's charming in the way tax lawyers are charming. You trust him until your assets vanish." Did he admit to anything? No. But his face cracked when I mentioned the envelope. Not enough to send to court, but enough to send to Saul. That meant he agreed, but wouldn't say so. "Remind me," I said, "why Charles Thorne was considered respectable." Wolfe grunted. "Because he paid taxes and hated poetry." "And the sister, Agatha Royce?" "Estranged, removed from the will, rumoured to have blackmailed Charles once during the war. Nice family." "All legacies," Wolfe said, "a salt beneath polished silver." I leaned against the doorframe. "You think Agatha has the envelope?" "I think," Wolfe said, finally turning, "that every person involved has a reason to hope it no longer exists. And Dane? He wants power. Agatha wants revenge. Miss Thorne, however, wants something neither can give her." I waited. Wolfe didn't elaborate. The orchids were quiet, and so was he. But I knew that look. We weren't just chasing an envelope. We were chasing whatever Charles Thorne left behind, and whoever was desperate enough to bury it in silence. We returned to the office. Lila was waiting, seated on the edge of the red chair like it might vanish beneath her. She didn't look up when we entered, just kept her hands folded like she was afraid they'd shake if she didn't. "Miss Thorne," Wolfe said, lowering himself into his chair. "We have discussed your fiancé and his intentions, but there is something else, something undeclared." She blinked. Once. Twice. "I told you everything." "No," Wolfe said. "You've told us everything you're prepared to admit." She drew in a breath like she'd been underwater too long. "There was someone," she said softly. "Before Clifford. Before the estate. Before everything." Wolfe didn't move. He didn't need to. "A chauffeur," she said. "His name was Carl. We were in love." "And what became of him?" Wolfe asked. "My father found out," she said. "He fired him, but not before—" Her voice broke. "Before what?" I asked. "Before he was beaten." I looked at Wolfe. His brows hadn't moved. "They said it was a mugging," she said. "But I knew. My father sent them." "And what became of Mr. Carl?" Wolfe asked. "He disappeared." "And the envelope?" She hesitated. "I don't know. I don't know what it said. But I think it was about Carl." Wolfe steepled his fingers. "Miss Thorne," he said, "grief is a cage, but secrets are cages too, only with thicker bars." She looked at him then, for the first time, really looked. "I just wanted to keep something mine," she said. "Just one thing." Wolfe didn't reply. He didn't have to. The next morning brought a grey drizzle and a new fact. Wolfe had me dig into Harrington, the estate lawyer Lila mentioned, the one Dane had chatted up like a friend. It didn't take long. Harrington had died. 2 weeks ago. Sudden heart attack, no autopsy requested. But it was the timing that scratched at Wolfe's logic like a hangnail. 2 weeks ago was just after Lila announced the engagement, just after the envelope disappeared, And now the only man who could verify the contents, or even confirm its existence, had dropped dead with no witnesses and no inquiry. I handed Wolfe the article, folded twice, with the obituary circled in red. He read it slowly, then reread it, then tossed it on the desk like it had insulted his vocabulary. Convenient, he said. Natural causes. Nature rarely aligns so neatly with opportunity. I nodded. So, we have a dead lawyer, a vanished envelope, a love affair buried under guilt, and a fiancé with the warmth of a Venetian banker. Wolfe stood. That was rare. He moved to the fireplace, clasping his hands behind his back. Archie, people do not kill over envelopes. No, they kill, he said. Over what envelopes reveal. The clock ticked. Fritz brought in tea, then wisely disappeared. I refilled Wolfe's cup. He didn't sip. We are not looking, Wolfe said quietly, for someone who fears exposure. I tilted my head. No? We are looking for someone, he said, who believes a truth must be buried. By fire, by silence, or by death. And that, I admit, made the back of my neck itch. By mid-afternoon, the rain had turned polite, the kind that tapped gently against the kitchen windows while Fritz ladled chestnut soup into porcelain bowls and muttered in German about the superiority of French poultry. Wolfe was in his usual position at the table, savouring the silence and his first course with equal satisfaction. I was not. Someone's been tailing me, I said, spoon halfway to my mouth. Third time in 2 days. Wolfe didn't look up. Do they wear a badge? No, civilian shoes, but steady hands, the type that knows which side of the paper to read in the subway. Then don't make sudden turns. You're not important enough to disappear. I sipped the soup, which, I had to admit, was excellent. Maybe they're after you. Bah! Fritz reappeared with the basket of warm rolls and slipped out again. Wolfe dabbed his lips and returned to his reading, Suetonius in Latin. I was tempted to swap it with last month's True Detective, just to see if he'd notice. I think Clifford Danes hired someone, I said. A little insurance in case we find something he'd prefer buried. If so, he's paid well. No one's broken your nose. Yet. He turned a page. A man's nose is not a clue, nor is his vanity. But I wasn't just whining for sport. That tale was real. And if someone was keeping tabs on me, it meant something in our little envelope caper had teeth. Then Fritz entered again. Not with dessert, but with an envelope of his own. From the front door, he said. It was addressed to Wolfe. The paper was thin, the ink anonymous. Wolfe opened it with one finger. The words were short, blocky, cruel, and the first line read, "You are helping a murderer." Wolfe read it once, then again, then laid it flat on the table like it was a dead thing he didn't want touching the silverware. Well, I said, there's your clue, and your critic. He didn't respond. I picked it up, read it. There was no signature, just a sentence at the bottom. She's lying. She always has. I met his gaze. You think it's about Lila? Who else? He stood and moved to the globe in the corner. When Wolfe stands after soup, you know the mood's shifting. I dislike anonymous letters, he muttered. They lack spine. I slid mine into an evidence envelope. You want it dusted for fingerprints? No, I want it compared to others. It took less than 10 minutes to confirm. When I called Lila, she didn't pretend. She didn't deflect. Yes, she whispered. I've received 2. The first one came 3 days ago. The second yesterday. They say, things. What kind of things? That I killed Carl. That shut me up. He's not dead, I said. He's just missing. I know. But someone wants me to think he is. Or that I made him disappear. Or that... She didn't finish. I reported back. Wolfe was pacing. He does that about twice a quarter, always on rugs made thick enough to absorb impact. So now, I said, Someone's targeting her sanity, not just her inheritance. Not targeting, Wolfe corrected. Establishing. If enough people believe she's unwell, her competency collapses. Who benefits? He didn't answer. Not yet, but his eyes were already scanning the letter again. This time not for words, but for marks. And what he saw next would give us a direction. And a destination. I've dealt with my share of ransom notes, crank letters, and fan mail addressed to Wolfe that reads like metaphysics on morphine. But this one had personality. Not the message, but the medium. Typewriter, I said. Not electric. Wolfe nodded. And not common. I leaned over his shoulder. The ribbon smudges left ghosting. Slight misalignment in the E's. Heavy impact on the M's. That's a manual royal, pre-war. Possibly a Remington, but yes, pre-1940. And the ribbon itself. He peered at the edge of the paper. Blue-black. High contrast. Nearly obsolete. That was my cue. I took the letter, stepped out into the wet New York afternoon, and made for the few remaining stores in Manhattan that sold anything other than toner cartridges and dreams. After 2 hours of polite refusals and one exceedingly rude stockboy, I hit gold in a narrow stationery shop on East 48th, the kind with brass fixtures and ledgers behind glass. The man behind the counter wore a vest, wire rims, and the weary eyes of a lifelong pen enthusiast. I slid the letter across. Recognized the ribbon? He peered, nodded once. Fournier and Holt, imported. I've sold exactly 3 in the last year. I straightened. Can you remember who bought them? He tapped his temple. One was a Columbia professor. One was an author, French-Canadian, terribly nervous. And one was a woman. Gloves, scarf, cash, no receipt. Scarf? I asked. Paisley. Deep red. Expensive. I left the store with the image sharpened in my mind, and one name rising to the surface like oil on water. Agatha Royce. Back in the brownstone, Wolfe listened with eyes half-lidded and hands templed. I gave him the full rundown. Shop, ribbon, clerk, scarf. When I got to the Paisley, he grunted. Miss Royce, he said, has a fondness for red. Always has. It makes her feel visible. I blinked. You've met her? Once, at a charity dinner. She despises me. Why? Because I saw through her compliments. I whistled low. So Agatha buys the ribbon, types the letters, sends 1 to us and 2 to Lila, hoping the mental instability route sticks. Precisely. But why now? Wolfe didn't answer. Instead, he picked up the envelope again, flipped it once, and dropped it into the fire grate without ceremony. It curled into ash with a sigh. She plays a long game, he said. But even long games end. I stepped to the window. The rain had thickened. Traffic groaned like the city was catching a cold. Think she's watching Lila? Wolfe didn't respond. His eyes were already scanning the next layer of deduction, invisible to me, but forming like frost across a mirror. So I made a choice. If Agatha Royce was stalking our client, she wouldn't do it from a parlor. She'd do it from a crowd. I grabbed my coat and went hunting. It didn't take long. Lila had a routine. She liked the bookshop on West 12th, near the church with the bell that rang 5 minutes late. She went there when she wanted quiet. I stayed across the street, under the awning of a flower shop that hadn't sold a rose since Easter. And sure enough, 12 minutes in, I saw her. Not Lila. Agatha. She was dressed for anonymity. Grey coat, wide hat, scarf, paisley, deep red. But her walk was wrong. She was too careful, too straight. The kind of posture people only wear when they're pretending they don't exist. She lingered by the travel section while Lila browsed biographies. Never too close, never out of sight. I crossed the street slowly, entered the store like I was looking for Agatha Christie and not Agatha Royce. And sure enough, when Lila moved, Agatha moved. No contact, just shadows. It wasn't inheritance she was after, not anymore. It was something quieter, stranger, fear, Revenge. I didn't know. Not yet. But as I stepped back outside into the mist and the low rumble of an approaching cab, one thought kept hammering. Why now? And what did she think Lila was about to remember? It took only a half hour of polite probing and one carefully placed question for me to discover that Clifford Dane had been engaged to someone else, a Broadway actress named Verna Caldwell, just 3 months before he supposedly pledged himself to Lila Thorne. The revelation wasn't shocking for its duplicity. Dane had the charm of a polished ledger, columns perfectly balanced but none of them honest. What got me was the timing. Right after Lila's announcement, right before the envelope disappeared, the pieces practically leapt from the page. I reported back to Wolfe in the brownstone, pacing in front of the orchids. He had another engagement, I said. 3 months ago, broadly publicized. Yet he claims devotion to Lila now. Wolfe regarded me over the rim of his glasses. Curious, and yet hardly criminal. I wouldn't call it criminal, I said, but morally, the man's accounts are in arrears. Accounts, yes, he said, with a sharpness that made the orchids quiver. But morality, Archie, is not a ledger to be audited. Sure, but when love and money mix, debits and credits don't always balance. He walked to the window and looked out, as if Manhattan itself might answer. Then we observe, he said, and deduce where the surplus lies. I scribbled a note. Dane's surplus lay somewhere between a heart and a trust clause. The moral accountants of New York's upper crust were at work again, and this time the entries were written in deceit. Verna Caldwell was as sharp-tongued in person as her reputation suggested. I found her in a tiny apartment overlooking the theatre district. 2 rooms, a kitchenette, and enough velvet drapery to make a cat sneeze. She didn't rise when I knocked. She just waited, perched like a hawk among her scripts. "You're Archie Goodwin," she said, reading my name badge like a headline. "I know Wolfe. What does he want?" "Just the facts," I said, "about Clifford Dane." Her lips tightened. I thought I'd seen him truly once. Foolish of me. "Did he marry you?" "No," she said, tossing a script onto the floor. "He dumped me the moment he received a family retainer. Large. Cash. He said it was for legacy purposes. Something about smoothing over an inheritance." I raised an eyebrow. "And that's when you stopped seeing him?" "Of course. Love has a price. I refuse to be a debtor." I scribbled furiously in my notebook. That explained a lot. Dane's cold calculation, the timing of Lila's engagement, the vanished envelope. "Do you think he loves Miss Thorne?" I asked. She laughed, a short, bitter sound. "Love? Archie, men like Dane do not love. They invest, and when they withdraw, the collateral is a heart." "Collateral, huh?" I murmured. "Yes," she said, "and his portfolio is carefully managed." I left with the sense that Dane's charm was a contract clause, Verna's bitterness a footnote, and the city itself a ledger where trust and deception danced in equal measure. Wolfe would enjoy the arithmetic. Back in the brownstone, Wolfe regarded me with that peculiar combination of patience and disdain that always made me feel simultaneously honored and ridiculous. I recounted the Caldwell interview. "Wolfe," I said, "he isn't just charming, he's methodical. He wants Lila to crack, so the family trust clause triggers, and Agatha and he take control." He lifted a finger. "Observation confirmed. Motivation clear. Execution to follow." "And you're going to let him push her over the edge?" "I am not permitting anything," he said. "But I am aware of every move, Archie. The objective is not her collapse. It is the revelation of truth." I smirked. "Truth? That's comforting." "Truth," he repeated, "is the single constant in all human affairs. The rest, desire, greed, affection, are variables. And in this equation, Dane is attempting to manipulate the variables to his advantage." I jotted notes on my pad. The calculation was simple enough for Wolfe. Drive the heiress to a state where her judgment could be questioned, then seize control of assets. But the moral calculus was a tangle of pride, vengeance, and greed, and Wolfe's interest in clarity made the human wreckage almost secondary. He waved a hand. "Archie, prepare to follow. We are about to observe the variable in action." I nodded, smiling at the irony. Wolfe, ever immovable, commanding movement in others, and so I would move. Saul Panzer was already in position before I had time to tell him the full story. Wolfe's instructions were crisp. Follow Dane, note every meeting, record every transaction. The bank was discreet, a private office in Midtown, blinds drawn against the public. Dane walked in with that same measured stride, a man who knew exactly which footsteps mattered. I watched Saul slip between shadows, his notebook ready. Dane checked in, spoke softly with the manager, and, as expected, handed over what I suspected were bearer bonds. The air smelled faintly of varnish and polished mahogany. Not enough to make anyone nervous, but enough to make a detective's pulse thrum. Wolfe's voice came through my phone in a low hiss. "Observe. He does not intend to leave an untraceable trail." "That is both hubris and error," I whispered. "Yes, sir." Minutes ticked. Dane's hands were precise, deliberate. The manager never looked up. The transaction concluded. Saul's notes were complete. I exhaled. Dane had turned legal machinery into a weapon. Everything was above board yet morally bankrupt, and Wolfe, I knew, was already calculating the consequences. "Bring this to Kramer," Wolfe said when I checked in. "We will see if legality can withstand truth." I returned to the brownstone with Saul's notes. The city outside was still indifferent, rain washing pavements in streaks of silver. Inside, Wolfe was in his chair, waiting, quiet, patient, and correct. I relayed the details to Wolfe. Dane had cashed the bonds, every signature and ledger entry accounted for. From the outside, no crime existed. From the moral perspective, everything was in flames. "Archie," Wolfe said, adjusting his glasses, "a crime has not only been committed, it has been legalized." I whistled softly. "That's bleak." "Bleak, yes, but unsurprising. Men in positions of wealth do not require the law to sanction their transgressions. They require opportunity, and Dane has found it." I sank into a chair. "So, we have greed, manipulation, and a ledger, but no murder, no actual illegality. Yet everyone will suffer." "Precisely," Wolfe said. "And if you have noted, Archie, suffering is often a more effective teacher than punishment." I scribbled in my notebook. He was right, as usual. Dane had managed to convert morality into numbers, affection into transactions, and the heiress into collateral. Outside, the drizzle had stopped. New York continued its indifferent hum. Inside, Wolfe sipped his tea, unmoved by the city's ethical decay, but fully aware of its mechanics. And me? I had notes, observations, and the distinct impression that the next move would be a dangerous one, not for the law, but for those whose hearts were caught in the calculations. The knock came lightly at first, almost apologetic, but with a tremor that carried through the entire brownstone. Fritz peeked around the kitchen doorway, sniffed once, then said, "Maria, the maid, she waits. She is uneasy." Wolfe, perched in his chair as if the universe itself were a tedious chessboard, barely blinked. "Show her in." Maria appeared, pale as the eggs Wolfe demanded be poached at precise 90 degrees, hands clasped like she was holding on to something she didn't want anyone to take. Her voice quavered. I saw Mr. Dane and Mrs. Royce," she said, "in the study. Lila's desk. They were rifling through it. The night the envelope disappeared." I folded my arms. "Rifling through it? How diligent. And dangerous." Maria shook her head. "I didn't touch anything. I swore I wouldn't. But I couldn't stop them." Her eyes darted toward Wolfe, seeking judgment. He didn't offer one. "Curious," Wolfe said softly, "that loyalty would conflict with observation." And yet, Miss Maria, you watched. Yes, she whispered. I watched. I leaned back, noting the tension. There was fear, yes, but also an undercurrent of moral indignation. The servant's conscience wrestling with the weight of family secrets. Wolfe simply nodded, absorbing the information like the orchids absorbed sunlight. I glanced at him. So, someone had access, and motive, and timing. Coincidence? Rarely in such matters, Wolfe replied. Mr. Goodwin, rarely. The envelope's disappearance had acquired a new dimension. It was no longer a simple misplacement. There were witnesses, and witnesses, as Maria trembled and confessed, were often the first to see the truth and the danger in the shadows. Maria, still pale, swallowed audibly. There is something else. Miss Lila, she has a prescription, anti-anxiety, but not under her name, a false name. I frowned. Someone wants to make her look unstable, that's why. Yes, Maria said, trembling again. To make people doubt her judgment, her competence. Wolfe, seated among his orchids, finally looked up. His expression was a precise calculation, a ledger of human behavior. And this is documented, I presume? Maria hesitated. The pharmacy has the records. I noted that for later. Let me guess, I said. The handwriting, the signature, the prescription number, all traceable to someone trying to discredit her. Yes, she whispered. Wolfe stood and paced slowly. Observe, Archie. Madness, whether real or perceived, is a potent instrument. Properly applied, it disarms logic. Improperly, it reveals desperation. I smirked. So the plan is to use medicine as a weapon, a legal chemical inquisition. He paused. Precisely, but the instrument must be wielded carefully. Too heavy a hand, and the malefactor is revealed. I jotted a note. Someone wanted the heiress in trouble, and had already started building the paperwork. Timing, access, and method were all perfectly aligned. The envelope had vanished, but the machinery behind its disappearance was now humming, louder than ever. The next morning, I made my way to the pharmacy in question. It was a small, spotless place on Lexington, with polished linoleum that shone like a legal document, and a counter-clerk who treated me as though I were either trouble or an overgrown schoolboy. I presented the prescription under the alias Maria had given me. Would you confirm if this was filled recently? I asked casually, though my eyes scanned the room for anything unusual. The clerk's lips twitched, almost imperceptibly. Yes, 2 weeks ago, provided by a person claiming to be her guardian. I raised an eyebrow. Her guardian, and not her? Correct. Identification provided. Everything proper, the clerk said, almost defensively. Payment in cash. I scribbled furiously. Someone was not just trying to discredit Lila. They were orchestrating a paper trail that would make her appear unstable. Every signature, every transaction, all traced back to a figure posing as authority. I leaned in. Would you describe the person who provided this? Woman, gloves, scarf, tall, purposeful, he said. Nervous, but exacting. I frowned, turning the description over in my mind. Gloves and scarf, precise, deliberate. Agatha Royce. Of course, the same woman who had already shown interest in the envelope. I left the pharmacy, feeling the city tighten around me like a vice. Wolfe would want a full report, and Saul would want a tail on. Anyone daring enough to mess with an heiress. But the threads were beginning to converge, and someone was about to get very uncomfortable. Back in the brownstone, Wolfe was seated amid the orchids, which seemed to lean toward him as if sensing the pattern forming in his mind. I delivered the news, the falsified prescription, the gloved woman, the timing. He steepled his fingers. Archie, observe the sequence. Dane has motive, Agatha has access, and the documentation exists to discredit the heiress. all converge toward a single objective: the usurpation of control under the pretense of mental incapacity. Brilliant, I said, but cruel. Human ingenuity is not measured in compassion, Mr. Goodwin, Wolfe said. It is measured in efficacy. I nodded, tapping my notebook. So the envelope was just the spark. This is the fire. Yes. And now, Wolfe said, eyes flicking to the window, the fire will be observed and contained. The players will reveal themselves, given sufficient stimulus. I smirked. Which means we let Dane and Agatha stir the pot while we record it. Precisely. Observation, deduction, restraint. The trinity of rational inquiry. Miss Thorne will remain unharmed in body, if not in nerves, but the truth must emerge. The orchids seemed to sigh. Fritz brought in coffee. Wolfe sipped, eyes closed, calculating, waiting, patient. I made a note. Incompetence will be revealed only through careful pressure, not haste. And the more precise the adversary, the more spectacular the eventual revelation. I sat back. The machinery of exposure was running, and someone was about to find out that Wolfe's patience is far more dangerous than anyone's malice. When the envelope finally returned to discussion, Wolfe leaned forward, his long fingers drumming on the arm of the chair. Miss Thorne, he said, the document itself was never financial in nature. It contained a confession, Charles Thorne's acknowledgement that Agatha had coerced him into erasing a rightful heir. Carl, the chauffeur, erased from legacy by wartime secrets. I sat, blinking. The air between us seemed to thicken with the weight of old sins. Agatha discovered it, Wolfe continued, voice flat, precise, and destroyed it. And that's why it vanished, I asked. Precisely. But notice the method. Fire, not theft. She intended not to conceal facts, but to erase evidence of leverage. A symbolic act, in keeping with the moral decay of her intent. Lila's face paled, though she tried to control it. Maria trembled lightly, realizing she had been witness to more than mischief. Archie, Wolfe said, eyes narrowing. We are not looking for someone who merely wants secrecy. We are looking for someone who wants a truth buried, with fire or blood. The words landed. Not a threat, not a prediction, a statement. I scribbled furiously. Someone wanted history obliterated, a truth burned into ash. And in that, calculation, morality, greed, love, and revenge all converged into a single dangerous vector. Outside, the city hummed. Inside, Wolfe's orchids seemed to stiffen. The hunt, I realized, had grown sharper, colder, and only those who understood the stakes could survive its logic. Wolfe didn't speak much on the morning I was sent to verify Carl's death certificate. He simply folded his hands, eyes on the orchids, and allowed the machinery of observation to do the work. I, on the other hand, was already out the door, immersed in a city that seemed just a little wetter and colder than usual. The death certificate was easy to find. The clerk behind the registrar's desk frowned at me. Mr. Goodwin, I've seen many requests, but why now? I'm verifying facts, I said, leaving my voice neutral. He handed me the paperwork. The signature looked proper, the seal authentic, but the date was suspiciously recent, and the style of the typeface betrayed forgery. A death certificate forged with skill, no doubt, but not enough to withstand scrutiny. Carl, the man presumed dead for years, might very well be alive. I carried the certificate back to Wolfe. He took it, his fingers brushing the paper delicately. Archie, a ledger entry that contradicts reality is more than a clerical error. It is a statement of intent. Someone wants the world to believe a lie, and lies, once institutionalized, gain the weight of truth. I nodded. So our ghost isn't really a ghost. He's just a man hiding under a new name. Question is, why? Wolfe regarded the orchids, then me. We shall see. Begin inquiries immediately. Find him. Let us determine the true value of an apparent death. And with that, I had a new objective. Find Carl, confirm that he was alive, and see what truths he carried beneath the veneer of absence. Saul Panzer had a knack for turning invisibility into a profession. By late afternoon, he had located Carl, living quietly in a small auto repair shop in Brooklyn, under a name that was not his own, but close enough to keep the neighbors satisfied. The place smelled faintly of grease and varnish, the kind of scent that promises hard work and secrecy in equal measure. I met Saul afterward at a diner, where he handed me a report scribbled in shorthand that only he could decipher. "He's alive," Saul said, voice low. "Shop's legit. Papers are in order. Keeps to himself. Doesn't appear to expect anyone to find him." "And the envelope?" I asked. Saul shrugged. "Never asked. He hasn't brought it up. But he looked uneasy when I mentioned Lila's name. A man in hiding usually does when the past shows its face." I sat back, chewing the end of a straw wrapper. Carl alive meant several things. A second set of eyes on the inheritance, a living connection to Lila's secret, and a tangible witness to deeds no ledger could record. And somewhere in that Brooklyn garage, he was more aware than anyone that a family's sins have long shadows. I folded Saul's notes into my notebook. "Good work," I said. Saul gave a non-committal grunt, already thinking about his next move, which would inevitably involve shadowing Dane or Royce. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe took the report in his hands, studying it as one might a rare coin. "Presence confirmed," he said, with the calm authority of a judge pronouncing sentence. "Now, let us determine motive and means. The living man holds more power than any ledger or envelope. Remember this, Archie, while observing his next movements." I approached Carl cautiously, aware that any misstep could undo months of careful concealment. He was lean, hands rough from labour, eyes wary but not unkind. I introduced myself, mentioned Wolfe, and watched as his expression shifted from suspicion to recognition. "Lila," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "How—" "Not her," I said. "Archie Goodwin. Mr. Wolfe sent me. He wants to know about the envelope, and about you." Carl's jaw tightened. Then, as if no one had ever asked, he began to speak. "Lila and I were in love," he said. "The kind of love that is loud in the heart but quiet in the world. Until her father, Charles Thorne, found out. Men were sent to make certain I vanished. And vanished I did." "And the envelope?" I asked. He swallowed. "It contained an apology and a trust. My name on it. Small, secret, safe. It was his way of making things right after what had happened. But Agatha," his voice faltered, "she found it, burned it." I made notes, noting the cadence of truth in his voice. There was guilt, yes, and fear, but loyalty ran beneath the surface. Lila's heart had been tied to a man erased by circumstances, and yet she had survived, if precariously. Carl's confession clarified the stakes. Dane's schemes were no longer abstract. They threatened not just paper and profit, but love, honour, and memory. "Why now?" I asked quietly. "Because she announced the engagement," Carl said. "And suddenly, everyone had to protect their interests, everyone except me. I just wanted her safe." I nodded. "Then you're part of this story, whether you like it or not, and Wolfe will want every detail." He exhaled, shoulders slumping. "I suppose I'm ready." And with that, the envelope's true purpose, apology and protection, became clear. The stage was set. The players were revealed. And the stakes had never been higher. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe gestured for Carl to sit in the chair opposite the orchids. The envelope's contents had transformed from rumour to fact. "Archie," Wolfe said, eyes narrowing on Carl. "Relate precisely what was contained within." Carl swallowed. "A letter, father's apology, and a trust fund in my name. Small, safe, but enough to have mattered. And then Agatha found it. She burned it." Wolfe leaned back, hands steepled. An act symbolic, as much as it was practical. Fire to obliterate leverage and ensure the continuation of deception. I glanced at the ashes in the fireplace. Means there's no proof now. Means, Wolfe said, voice flat, that morality must be inferred from action, and strategy from intent. Carl's eyes fell. I didn't ask for it. I never wanted to inherit from them. I only wanted her safe. Safety, Wolfe mused, is relative. In this house, observation and patience often achieve what protection cannot. I noted the subtle tension. Loyalty, greed, and love all intersected here, bound in paper and smoke. Agatha's interference had been both ruthless and elegant, a moral calculus only Wolfe could interpret without flinching. Archie, Wolfe said finally, we are now aware of all relevant variables. Each person holds a piece of the puzzle, and every action has meaning. Outside, the rain fell lightly. Inside, the orchids stirred imperceptibly. Carl remained silent, but his presence, once erased, now illuminated a path Wolfe intended to follow. Wolfe's voice broke the silence. Archie, summon all involved parties to the brownstone. Tonight, we shall observe human nature in its purest form. I made calls with practiced efficiency. Invitations delivered, confirmations received. Lila, Clifford, Agatha, Carl, Maria, and Inspector Kramer would all be present. Wolfe arranged a tray of glasses himself, his fingers precise, deliberate. He set them in a perfect line. Then, without ceremony, he said, "We will drink to betrayal, and then name the truest traitor of all." The words were heavy, measured. Not a toast, but a statement. I could feel the tension coil in the room, ready to snap. The pieces were in place. And yet, the question that hung in the air was more dangerous than any ledger or envelope. Who among them would falter first? The stage was set, and Wolfe, as always, would remain calm while the world revealed its character. The brownstone felt unusually solemn that evening. Rain tapped lightly against the windows, a soft percussion to accompany the suspense. One by one, the guests arrived. Lila entered first, poised but anxious, the heels of her shoes clicking like a metronome counting down to something inevitable. Clifford followed, smiling with the calculated charm of a man who believes charm can excuse anything. Agatha Royce drifted in next, scarf and gloves in place, eyes alert for imagined slights and old grudges. Carl came quietly, tall and lean, a man who had been presumed dead, but now radiated a subdued gravity that only years of near erasure could grant. Maria hovered behind him, nervously smoothing her apron, loyalty and fear warring on her pale face. Finally, Inspector Kramer arrived, hat in hand, his expression the exact combination of skepticism and obligation that only he could wear. Wolfe had the sherry glasses lined up perfectly along the sideboard, each one catching the light just so. "Sherry," he intoned. "Sip if you wish. Speak when spoken to. Consider silence your shield and your weapon." I leaned against the doorway, notebook in hand, observing the small currents of unease and anticipation ripple through the room. Even the orchids seemed to stiffen, as if sensing the moral storm about to unfold. The brownstone was quiet, yes, but it was a heavy quiet, the kind that presses down on your shoulders and makes your spine alert. And I knew, before a word had been spoken, that none of us would leave unchanged. Wolfe began as he always did, with observation. "Mr. Dane," he said, voice precise, slicing through the tension, "let us speak frankly. Your engagement to Miss Thorne was, I presume, motivated by affection and honour." Clifford's smile tightened. Affection, perhaps. Honour, certainly. But you are astute, Mr. Wolfe. There were financial considerations. Wolfe's eyes narrowed, cutting through the pretense. "Ah, a calculated investment, then. Emotional compliance for the sake of capital, a trust clause invoked by duress." Clifford leaned back, fingers drumming lightly on his glass. I prefer to call it strategic. Marriage, in my world, has always been a partnership of interests. Indeed, Wolfe said, and the interests you chose to prioritize were not hers. They were your own, and those of others who wished to see her fortune controlled by design rather than affection. I scribbled in my notebook. The pattern was clear. Dane had orchestrated a scheme leveraging the engagement as a tool for legal and financial control. Yet even under Wolfe's scrutiny, he maintained a veneer of civility. There was no bluster, no theatrics, just greed wrapped in charm. The moral of it, Wolfe implied without stating, was that wealth and manipulation travel best when cloaked in civility. And as Clifford's admission hung in the air, I could feel the other guests shifting subtly, awareness dawning that each move, each motive, was now under the scrutiny of an intellect that allowed no deception to stand unexamined. Wolfe turned next, his gaze settling on Agatha Royce. The room seemed to contract slightly around her. "Miss Royce," he began, "the letter you discovered, now destroyed. I understand you justify the act as emotional justice. Pray explain." Agatha's eyes blazed, though she remained seated, gloves folded in her lap. "My family erased me from the legacy. Charles Thorne took from me what was mine by right. The letter, it was my reckoning. I returned the injustice to its rightful owner, not with money, but with consequence." Wolfe's hands steepled, and in doing so, you chose fire over deliberation, destruction over revelation. Yet I suspect you failed to appreciate that the letter contained more than grievance. It contained accountability, unspent and unrevealed. She flinched at the implication but held her head high. He would have ignored it. I ensured that I mattered. "Indeed," Wolfe said softly. "Matter, yes. But the cost of that matter is the distortion of truth, the manipulation of others, and the assumption that one may act as judge and executor in a matter where neither authority nor law grants them such privilege." I scribbled furiously, noting the ethical calculus at play. Agatha's moral certainty was a shield, her logic a weapon. Yet Wolfe dissected it with the precision of a surgeon, detached, incisive, merciless in the pursuit of understanding. And as the ashes of that moral conflict settled over the room, the next revelation loomed. Wolfe leaned forward, eyes gleaming. "Carl, you were prudent enough to duplicate the contents of the burned envelope before it vanished." Carl nodded slightly. "I couldn't risk its destruction entirely. She had no right." Wolfe held the duplicate aloft, letting the light catch the paper. "And so," he said, "truth endures, despite attempts at erasure. The fire did not consume it. The letter survives." I felt the tension snap just a fraction. Here was evidence, tangible yet symbolic. The truth that refused to burn. "The implications are significant," Wolfe continued, turning his gaze to the assembled guests. "What has been hidden, what has been destroyed, may still be revealed. And revelation, I assure you, carries consequences." Even Agatha shifted slightly, a flicker of unease passing across her carefully composed features. I scribbled in my notebook. Duplicate or not, the letter had become more than paper. It was a moral mirror. And Wolfe, as always, had the patience to hold it until the world looked upon it in full. Wolfe's attention finally turned to Lila. "Miss Thorne, you have observed the machinations around you. Pray, speak your own truth." Her hands trembled, though she held her posture. "The envelope, it was never meant to deceive entirely. I created it. I needed my family to confront what they had hidden. I wanted them to reveal their schemes, their motives, their greed." A murmur passed through the room. Wolfe said nothing, letting her words settle. "I thought," Lila continued, voice stronger, "that if they believed it contained something valuable, they would act. And through their actions, the truth would surface. I forced the confrontation." Clifford's lips tightened. Agatha's eyes narrowed. Even Carl shifted uneasily. Wolfe, hands clasped behind his back, studied her like one might observe a rare orchid. "So you orchestrated a scandal to compel confession," he said. "A stratagem of moral revelation under the guise of deception." "Yes," Lila admitted. "I betrayed them, but not for myself. I wanted truth, and I wanted to see who would act from greed and who from conscience." I scribbled quickly. Here was betrayal, yes, but righteous and calculated. Her maneuver exposed both duplicity and virtue, yet left her morally ambiguous. The architect of a scheme designed to reveal sins she could not otherwise witness. Lila's eyes glistened, tears held just behind her lashes. "I only ever wanted someone to choose me over the money," she said softly. "But no one ever did." The room fell silent. The rain outside whispered against the windows like the faint echo of judgment. Wolfe did not comment. He simply observed the balance of guilt, love, and calculation that had finally settled across the players. I leaned back, noting the moral gravity in every face. Betrayal had been both weapon and revelation. Confession had occurred, sins had been revealed, and yet, in the stillness, a human truth emerged. Choice, not wealth, defines allegiance. The brownstone itself seemed to exhale. Silence carried more meaning than words, and as Lila's statement hung in the air, I realized that the game was over. But its lessons, subtle and sharp, would linger far longer than any envelope, any letter, or any inheritance. Kramer's heels clicked against the parquet as he escorted Clifford Dane and Agatha Royce down the stairs. Wolfe watched from his chair, hands clasped behind his head, orchids swaying gently in the background. The inspector's expression was a careful mask of triumph. Underneath, irritation simmered. He was proud enough to have a case closed, but frustrated that the law's machinery often required his patience more than his intellect. Clifford's jaw was set, but not in defeat, in calculation. He had been bested, yet the smirk he gave Kramer was the kind that said he would survive. Agatha's eyes darted from the door to Wolfe and back again, a silent accusation of unfairness lingering in the air. I followed behind, notebook in hand, absorbing the tension that hung heavier than the afternoon light. The scene was a study in moral ambiguity. Legal justice served, yet the people involved were far from satisfied. Kramer muttered something under his breath about paperwork and procedures. Wolfe didn't answer, of course. He never did, unless the world needed correction, which in this case it did not. Outside, the rain had ceased, leaving puddles that mirrored the brownstone's stoic windows. And as the trio disappeared down the street, I realized that victory had a peculiar taste. Not triumph, but the dry, restrained flavor of obligations met and tempers restrained. Back in the brownstone, Wolfe's gaze found Carl, who stood quietly near the fireplace. The duplicate of Charles Thorne's letter lay in Wolfe's hand, a tangible reminder of sins and secrets exposed. "I've decided," Carl said softly. "I don't want the trust fund. Some legacies aren't worth touching." I blinked. "You're turning down money most people would kill to get." Carl shrugged. "I don't need it. And I don't want to be the reason for more betrayal or bitterness. I've lived with enough of both." Wolfe's thin lips curved into the faintest semblance of approval. A rare sentiment, Mr. Goodwin would agree, in a city, measured by ledger and asset. Mr. Carl demonstrates a form of dignity absent in most. I scribbled furiously. Carl's choice revealed more than restraint. It exposed moral priority, the kind that cannot be quantified, inherited, or forced. In this house, where paper and promises had long collided, Carl's quiet refusal was a statement stronger than any legal document. Maria watched him, eyes wide, comprehension dawning. Loyalty and conscience intertwined in her gaze. Lila, wherever she had gone, would have understood. And Wolfe, still as immovable as his orchids, simply nodded once, eyes glinting with that rare satisfaction reserved for those who chose principle over profit. Outside, New York's bustle carried on, oblivious to such quiet triumphs. Inside, the brownstone held its calm, the echoes of decisions made, choices honored, and a man who would not be corrupted by what was not rightfully his. News traveled slowly, but when it did, it was more rumor than fact. Lila Thorne had left the country. Europe, they said, though no one knew exactly where. No announcement, no press release, no hint of reconciliation or regret. She was gone, and with her absence came a silence louder than any accusation. I sat by the window, watching pedestrians navigate puddles left by a passing storm, and reflected on the emptiness she left behind. There were no charges, no courtroom battles, only the echo of decisions, betrayals, and confessions left to settle like ash on the mantelpiece. Wolfe, as always, remained unshaken. He was the pillar amid human drama, measuring the worth of choices with the cold precision of logic. Yet even he could not replace what had vanished. Carl, Maria, and the rest moved about the brownstone, each processing the silence in their own way. I noted the absence not as an ending, but as a weight, an unresolved presence that forced reflection. People departed for many reasons, but the quiet departure of an heiress, orchestrated by her own cunning and desire for truth, carried a significance that lingered in every empty chair, every muted conversation, and the gentle sway of the orchids in their timeless patience. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat in the brownstone's library, watching Wolfe tend to the fireplace. The remnants of the duplicated letter smouldered gently, smoke curling in delicate spirals, mingling with the scent of aged paper and polished wood. Betrayal had cut across the room, across the family, and across the city in waves subtle and devastating. Sometimes, I mused, betrayal saves you, by revealing truth that would otherwise fester, by exposing weakness before it becomes ruin. Other times, it wounds with surgical precision, leaving scars in trust and memory alike. And always, it changes the game. People move differently afterward, cautious, reflective, measured. I considered Carl's refusal, Lila's orchestrated scandal, Dane's ambition, Agatha's fire, each act a facet of human nature in its rawest form. Moral consequence and strategic calculation had collided in the brownstone with the intensity of a quiet storm, and Wolfe, the constant observer, had seen each outcome without surprise. I wrote in my notebook, greed, love, loyalty, deception, all quantifiable only in how they shift the behavior of others. Betrayal is both weapon and revelation, and here in the calm aftermath, it had left every player altered, their choices resonating long after the immediate danger had passed. Even the orchids seemed to lean toward the fire, absorbing lessons no human could articulate, silent witnesses to the interplay of wealth, conscience, and morality. And in that quiet, I realized the city outside could continue without pause, but within these walls, nothing would ever be quite the same. Wolfe reached for the carbon copy of the letter, holding it like a fragile remnant of truth. He did not glance at anyone, did not speak a word. With a measured motion, he placed it into the fire. The flames leapt briefly, consuming paper that had carried confessions, regrets, and the moral weight of a family's sins. "This is not concealment," he said finally, voice calm, resonant, unyielding. "It is closure." I watched the paper curl and blacken, the ashes scattering like a quiet judgment across the hearth. Wolfe's eyes were fixed on the fire, a man untroubled by sentiment, yet fully aware of consequence. "In the matter of family legacies," he continued, "blood is never thicker than inheritance law." The words hung in the room like a final toll. There was no applause, no relief, no victory. Only the understanding that human motives, however noble or vile, are measured in decisions and their outcomes, not in sentiment. I poured myself a final cup of coffee, letting the warmth settle while the room exhaled. The rain had stopped. Silence held the brownstone, complete and unbroken. And in that quiet, I reflected on everything revealed and everything irretrievably lost. Wolfe remained seated, patient, his orchids untouched by chaos, and the city outside carried on, indifferent but enriched by the moral arithmetic of those who dwell within the house of thorn. The brownstone has fallen silent, its orchids untouched, its hearth holding only the quiet memory of secrets revealed and confessions extinguished. Each of those who played their part has carried away something heavier than knowledge, lessons in trust, greed, and the choices that define us. As you reflect on the paths taken and the hearts tested, consider this. In a world where truth is fragile and loyalty fragile still, what would you have done in Wolfe's place? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoyed the mystery, be sure to like the video, share it with someone who loves detective stories, and subscribe for more. Sometimes, even the sharpest minds can't escape the shadows of the past.